I don't know how that works in Turkish, but you can't say to people in the street, nice couple. Yeah? But one of them was really good. It was, nice couple, warm terrace, good food, come spend money with me. I understand the communicative message there, but this guy has translated it wrongly. It's worth looking at those things. There are hundreds and hundreds of places on the web where you can get hold of this kind of stuff. The easiest way is to Google the word Chinglish, which is a fairly offensive word, it has to be said, and some of the laughter is rather unpleasant. But it will bring you some of these good mistranslations. There are whole books devoted to it. This is my favorite. Another thing I'd like to suggest is that starting from an English text, I mean, here I've done it with one sentence, but we could be doing this with longer pieces of discourse, 3-4 line paragraphs kind of stuff, is to take an English text which you want to look at in some way and take 2 translations of it, and to give your students 2 translations into mother tongue, but without showing them the original. Their job is to look at both of these translations and try to work out what the English was and which of these translations is better. I'll give you a second. What's the original of these? Okay, it's a line from Robert Frost. This works quite well again, and again you can see that the focus is very much on the process of the translating. It doesn't really matter that that is the answer. It could be all sorts of things. Another activity which leads on quite neatly from this, especially if we're looking at longer pieces of text, is that if we were then to relocate, I won't put it up, if we were to relocate this sentence from Robert Frost into the discoursal context from which it came, yeah, we can give students alternatives. Let's say we've got a little Turkish text, but they're looking at going into English. Well, let's give them different syntactic alternatives. Poetry is what gets lost in translation. Poetry gets lost in translation. It's poetry that gets lost in translation, etc., etc. Provide the students with maybe 5, 6 different syntactical variations, get them to look, translations, variations, get them to look at the original discoursal context, and their job is to discuss, again, which of these is the most appropriate in the context of the discourse. These are short, simple, little things which you can stick in. I'm going to keep going, throw another 5 minutes of these things at you. Technology, things which are technology related, of course make sense because of my technological reason for promoting translation. The ultimate technological tool would be a Babelfish. The Babelfish was imagined by Douglas Adams in his book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And there's a little sort of device which looks like a fish which you stick in your ear. And it taps into your brain waves, and you can understand everything from any language that anybody says to you. Unfortunately, in the book, the Babelfish leads to massive international wars, the worst wars of known history, since total comprehension between cultures led to these wars. So maybe Babelfish wouldn't be ideal, but we need something. The tools that we need to know about are these. There's first of all the Yahoo Babelfish translation tool. At the moment, this doesn't have a Turkish option, but some of you may find this useful to turn to as well. There's Google Translate, which I recommend most highly. There's WorldLingo, there's Bing, but there are plenty of others. Of them all, it's Google Translate, which is the most interesting because it's a probability, it's a statistically organized system. It doesn't have some kind of syntactic rules in there. It's only based on statistical analysis of a corpus. And it tends to work better than the others, and it's also interactive. I'll say a little bit more. WorldLingo I don't think is very good. With these tools, there's quite a few things that we can do. Again, looking at texts that we've used in class, well, let's stick one of these texts, cut and paste them into a translation tool, and get our students to translate it back again. Very easy to do. Or let's get them to correct the translation. They can probably only do this from English into Turkish. Very few people would have good enough English, it'd be C2 level at least, to be able to identify where the problems are in the English translation. We're going from English to mother tongue to Turkish. Yeah? But we could do this with almost any kind of text that we want to use in the classroom, any kind of text which has intrinsic interest. Type it in, convert it into your student's mother tongue, distribute it to them, and their job is to make the Turkish translation acceptable, i.e. avoiding the kind of rubbish translations that I was offered with The Lord of the Rings. Simple activity. It's the fact that the translations aren't very good that makes these interesting tools, valuable teaching tools. And one of the nice features about the Google Translate tool is that it gives this interactive thing. It invites the users to tick whether the translation is acceptable or not. So it would be clearly useful for your students to start playing this game and saying, no, this is not acceptable into Turkish, this is not, because that will improve the tool, but it's sensitizing them to what's going on. There are all sorts of other things which we can play around with these. One thing I quite enjoy doing is what's called Babelizing. Taking a sentence, so translation does not entail a return to the dry and dusty days of grammar translation at its worst. And there's a program which you'll find on the handout site which will Babelize this for you. What that means is that it'll translate it into another language randomly, in this case Portuguese. Then it'll translate it back into English from the Portuguese. It'll then translate it into another random language, in this case Japanese. And then it'll translate it back into English, which gives you this Babelized version of the original sentence. And playing around with Babelized English, again, is a linguistically very rich resource, because it's a way of encouraging our students to notice what is acceptable and what's appropriate and what's not. So giving them this kind of language, what do you think the original was? And if you've got online technology in the classroom, well, then they can actually play around with it themselves and try to get back to an acceptable original. Okay. I'd like to talk about the use of video. Translating written texts on paper can be really rather dull. Translating spoken texts into subtitles can be great fun and highly motivating. And you'll find a reference again on the handout to software which enables you to embed subtitles into any kind of movie clips that they want. I would be particularly interested, and I mean this absolutely seriously, if any of your students were working on the soap opera Suleiman the Magnificent that's apparently going on at the moment, if they could subtitle it into English for me. Love to find out what's going on in things like that. But anything which is going to attract their attention is going to make sense. This is an example of an anime, and this is the official the official subtitles, which are quite fun because they haven't quite worked out what is English and what's Japanese. I'll show you how this continues. I like that takoyaki bit at the end there. But at a more sophisticated level, there is a lot of fun to be had from getting your students to translate things deliberately badly. This is based on a Monty Python sketch, The Hungarian Phrase Book, where a man goes into a shop and he thinks he's using the phrase book from Hungarian into English to ask for a box of matches. And he's actually saying things like, "Do you want to come back to my place, bouncy, bouncy?" So this deliberate sort of mistranslation, again, is a very creative way of playing around with it at a higher level, I suggest. So playing around with video clips and using subtitles, great fun. There's also, I'll add to this, the technique of chuchotage, or lectoring, it's sometimes called. If you go to places like Bulgaria, for example, you'll find that many TV programs in English have a voiceover in Bulgarian. Very common in Eastern Europe in the past. And again, we can play around with this. Students work in groups to prepare some kind of translation, whichever way you want to go, Turkish into English, English into Turkish, and they do these kind of voiceovers. It's fun for them to do as well, because they have to try to synchronize their voiced over stuff with what's being said on the screen. So you have the TV screen, the computer screen in the classroom with the video clip going on, and a student standing next to it, reading aloud a prepared translation which they're trying to synchronize with the images on the screen. Again, it's much more fun than translating a page of Jane Austen, for example. I'll wrap up. The kinds of things I've been suggesting are more full-blown activities, but I would wish to promote even more than that, I think, the kinds of day-to-day classroom management things which will bring L1 and translation back into the classroom. One of the most aggressively argued books on this topic by a German, Caldwell, an English guy, they argue very, very strongly for a technique which they call sandwiching, where when a teacher is addressing the class, they're systematically using mother tongue. So they're speaking to them. Let's imagine, if you will permit me, that you're a French-speaking audience, and I'm addressing you, je vous adresse. You just include from time to time those kinds of things which are problematic. Particularly if you know the students aren't going to understand you anyway. So providing little mother tongue glosses from time to time is a way of pushing the language learning potential forward. I think too, when it comes to managing speaking activities, why not allow students preparation time before they have to speak, and why not allow them to do it in mother tongue? If they need to speak mother tongue when they're speaking, allow them to do so from time to time. You can build little techniques in. You could, for example, ask one student to make a note of all the mother tongue that was used during a discussion, and then you use that as data to analyze later. So what did you find hard? You couldn't say that in English, you needed to use Turkish. Well, then that's a rich resource for you later. So there are these kinds of little activities which make a lot of sense. You do role plays. Well, instead of having two people do a role play, why not have three? One who's pretending to be monolingual, one who's pretending to be monolingual English, and an interpreter in the middle. Yeah? This kind of stuff. The possibilities are really endless. None of this bears any relation to that now who will do the next sentence. This all seems to me to belong to a process-driven approach to language learning. It's contemporary. It makes sense, particularly, I think, in the intercultural terms, and there's a lot to explore. If you never use mother tongue in the classroom, perhaps you should start thinking about it. This is the address of the handout with links to video clips and so on. Be very, very pleased to hear from you there. Thank you.